And so begins our video on the Sages of Cradle. In this video, we're going to talk about what we know about sages from the text. We're going to talk about who the sages are, the sages that we know of that have been referenced in the books. We'll talk about what I think makes a sage, and we'll talk about what I think differentiates a sage between a herald. I get into that in like the last 5 minutes of the video. So, enjoy. All right, let's get into this. The Sages of Cradle. Let's start with what we know of what a sage is. A sage is the greatest of the Arc Lords. This is a quote from Narugwe. As an Underlord, he wouldn't last any longer against an Arc Lord than a Copper would, and the sages were the greatest of the Arc Lords. This is an important distinction for several reasons, but one, we know that a sage is not a herald. A sage is different. A sage is not an advancement level as we think of it. They are just the greatest of the Arc Lords for a specific reason. We know that they are specialized in some way. So there are multiple sword sages on the continent. We'll get into them. Whenever Narugwe is interrogating Linden, they get into a questioning match, and Narugwe is asking, what sage is she an apprentice to? He says the sword sage. Which sword sage? Which freaks out Linden. There's more than one. So, yes, there are types of sages. We've seen two examples. We've seen sword sages and we've seen heart sages. So I feel like that will play into my theories at the end of this video on what makes a sage. Like what do you have to do to become a sage? All right, let us move on. Does a sage have to become a herald? I only put this at this point in the video because we have some quotes on it. So, user Greg asks Will, do sages ever become heralds? Then Will says yes. However, I might change my mind on that. So, I don't know if Will has moved more towards changing his mind on that by this point, because I don't know when this question was asked, but it was, I think, more than a year ago. Based on what I've read in the books, I think it might be yes. I think it might be yes. And I'll talk about that later. All right. So now we're going to get into the sages that we know. All the sages that we've seen mentioned throughout the books. All right, let's go. First is the Sage of Silverheart. That's Akura Charity. She's on the path of Silverheart, using the Book of Silverheart of the Book of the Path of the 7 Pages. She is 168 years old, so she's an old cookie. We know this because Mercy is 18, and Mercy says, it would have been too strange to have a woman 150 years older than her call her Aunt Mercy. We also hear King Dakota telling his son that in his grandfather's day, the Sage of Silverheart pitted her against the Winter's Blade sect. So don't forget that. Winter's Blade, well, we get later on. Anyway, next we have the Sage of Red Faith. The Sage of Red Faith is, we don't know his name, we don't know his path, but we do know he uses a blood shadow, obviously, because he's the Sage of Red Moon Hall, the Sage of Red Faith, and he uses the blood shadow clone version of the 3 kinds, similar to Ruby, which is what I think Blaren should be called at this point. We know that he's at least 800 years old. We know this because the Transcendent Ruins last rose 800 years ago, and he had a dream tablet in the ruins from when he was already a lord. It was a dream tablet that Ethan took. So this is a quote from Ethan. I took 2 of them. 2 of these dream tablets I took from the Transcendent Ruins. The first is from a researcher who examined the Bleeding Phoenix directly. The other is from the man who would become the Sage of Red Faith. So the Sage of Red Faith had a dream tablet taken of his and placed in the Transcendent Ruins at least 800 years ago, because that was the last time it could have been placed there. So this guy is twice the age of Akura Malice. He's probably around the age of Reagan Shen. And so why hasn't he progressed? I don't know. We'll get into that whenever I get into the theories of what a sage is. So anyway, moving on. Now we're going to get into some that we don't really know too much about. We have the Sage of Brooms, mentioned once. This was when Yaren was trying to figure out who Ethan was. Let's not throw our doors wide just yet. You say you're from the Black Flame Empire, but who are you? And then he does his Ethan thing. Young lady, I am the greatest janitor in all of existence. I'm the son of a janitor, last in a long line of janitors that stretch all the way back to the Sage of Brooms and beyond. Now, a lot of people have speculated that the Sage of Brooms is in fact our friend Osriel. That could be very likely. But if it is Osriel, for those of you that say that Osriel was the start of the Aurelius clan, was the first to bring the Aurelius clan to power, maybe. However, he says back to the Sage of Brooms and beyond. So that would mean it goes further back than Osriel, which leads into my speculation that the Aurelius family has been around as long or close to as long as the Nine Cloud court or as the Nine Cloud royal family. Which means Ethan, the Aurelius family, may have a succession plan built into their system. If you want to watch the video I'm referencing, there's an information bubble there that will take you to that. But I have digressed. So let's get into the Sage of Thousand Eyes, also an Aurelius sage. What about the Aurelius homeland? The Sage of Thousand Eyes has an honorable reputation. She would come to our aid. And then Ethan winces because he thinks she's probably dead. And then he has condescending thoughts about her, not thinking she's wise. We have one more Aurelius sage mentioned by Cassius, but he doesn't mention his name. He just mentions that he saw a male sage, so it was not the Sage of a Thousand Eyes. So the Aurelius family must have multiple super powerful people. Then we have the Winter Sage, or the Sage of Frozen Blade, or the Sage of Winter's Blade. This sage has a ton of different names, but we know that she is a sword sage. So we'll get into a couple of these quotes here. Finding a sage might be tricky. I have it. Oh, and I also think it's interesting. She's mentioned in 3 consecutive books. 3 consecutive books. I have it on good authority that the Sage of Endless Sword was killed, which leaves Frozen Blade and Silverheart under Lady Li Min Redflower. So she's the Sage of Frozen Blade, but then in this next one, she's called the Winter Sage. But then in the next book, her sect is called the Winter's Blade sect, which is apparently a vassal state of the of the Akura clan, which is interesting. It is heavily implied that she had some sort of relationship with the Sage of Endless Sword, because it is heavily speculated, and there is a word of will that adds to this speculation, that the sword that that Tim the Sword Sage used, which has a frost-like quality to it, which we see Yaren using. Most predominantly, the frost quality is shown in Soulsmith. I think one of the most obvious is when they first get to the Transcendent Ruins, and then she has to basically show her strength at the Sand Vipers, and she beats up a Sand Viper chick, puts her sword on top of the Sand Viper chick's head, and the chick's hair basically frosts over. So the Sand Viper Sacred Artist got to see firsthand that this sword, just in its presence, creates a frosty nature. We don't really see that mentioned much later on, but it is implied in the Word of Will that this sword was created by the Sage of Frozen Blade, or was a gift of some sort. So that's interesting. All right, now we're going to get into the Sage of the Endless Sword, or Tim. This is a slide that I showed in my last video about how Tim is definitely dead. And this goes into the history of his name. But yeah, Tim is definitely dead. He died because of the circumstances of where he was, some very specific spoilery circumstances. You can go watch that video if you want. This is that slide where, yes, he definitely died. There's a word of will involved. But now we're going to get into a little bit of speculation. But first, I want to show you a very interesting passage that talks about how one can become a sage even when they're already a monarch. Like what that kind of requires. Okay, so let's get into that because it's pretty cool. All right, so how Tim did it. I think this was during one of the world building sessions that Will did, and I'm so glad that this person asked this question. How did the Sage of Endless Sword become a sage? As an Arc Lord, I'm going to read this because it's cool. You can pause this, read it, and skip over me reading, but it's cool, so I'm going to read it. As an Arc Lord, the Sage of Endless Sword was blessed enough to cross swords with a sword-wielding monarch. We don't know who this monarch is. Without getting obliterated. Swearing not to waste that opportunity, he tracked down an ancient remnant called Memory on the path of 1,000 dreams. She made sure his recollection of the fight would stay fresh, so he could experience the feeling of the monarch's power every day as though for the first time. Now, this is important because the monarch's power. We know that there is a magic system after the Lord Realm and before using the way, okay? He began traveling the world from sword path to sword path, sensing their techniques and trying to develop a power closer to that of the monarchs. So he's trying to mimic and create techniques that have the same power as that of a monarch's. As an experienced refiner, he also tracked down natural treasures attuned to the sword. Spirit fruits, sacred herbs, and the parts of sacred beasts that gathered sword aura. This is where the story gets spoilery. But a long story short, this quest led him to distinguishing himself as a sage. Sorry for the anticlimax, but I have to dance around the details of how one becomes a sage. Still, I hope that's enough. Okay, so he goes on this quest, this sage quest, where he's trying to mimic the specific power of a sword-wielding monarch. So a monarch that already practices this magic system, where he fuses his techniques with more than just soulfire and uses more than just Madra. Okay? I think a sage is an Arc Lord that unlocks or figures out how to access that magic system and create new techniques specific to their path. And because of that, they can't teach anyone because all of their techniques now are built around this extra magic system plus Soulfire plus their Madra, right? So sages don't take disciples because they can't teach them anything, which is weird why the Winter's Blade is a sect in and of itself. So I don't know. Maybe there is no Sage of Winter's Blade. It's just Sage of Frozen Blade or the Winter Sage. Maybe the Winter Sage came from the Winter's Blade sect. Who knows? But these are kind of my theories around the Sage. I also want to talk about something about the power level of a Sage. So we hear many times that the longer you practice a technique, the more powerful it is, the more efficient it is, the faster you are at using it, the more effective it is, right? It's not all about your core power. It's about the skill with which you use an ability. This makes sense. Humans, we have neurological pathways. Habits are formed when we create a neural pathway, and the more we do it, the more those pathways are wrapped in something called myelin that speeds them up, that makes those habits faster and stronger. It's why athletes are able to do crazy things. It's why the best three-point shooters are able to catch and shoot every time. it's the same concept with the spirit too. The more you use an ability, the more your body gets used to doing it, the faster you get. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but the point is, a sage is using extra power in an area where their Madra has some ability to manipulate space, and they are able to affect or combine that power with these very special abilities designed to incorporate that. They're built around that. And so I think that they're able to compete on the stage of a herald. I think that sages are as powerful as heralds. I think there might be something else with heralds that we don't know about, but this isn't a video about heralds, so I don't have to go into that. I think that by the end of the series, sages can become monarchs. They don't have to become heralds first. That's my thought, because we have, and the reason why I brought up age is we have two sages that are relatively old. So we have a monarch that's 400, who, from what we can tell, is a genius. She's a monarch that's able to fight off a dread god by herself. She's a monarch that has the respect of the oldest living monarch. And not only that, she's taken over 3/4 of the continent that she shares with said monarch, that apparently hates humans. So she's got to be something special. So 400 years to become a monarch is crazy. Charity also seems to be brilliant, but she's 168 years old now. She still hasn't become a herald or a monarch. She hasn't progressed. I don't know if there's only a certain number of monarchs that can exist on the planet. That would be interesting. But she hasn't progressed. So I think that a sage is able to get stronger. A sage can continue to get stronger. I don't know if a herald can continue to get stronger once they're at peak, but I think a sage can continue going. So I think eventually a sage can become more powerful than a herald. We see that overlap exist, and I think the gap between herald and monarch is way bigger than the gap between gold and lord. It has to be, because we see Charity try and get into Ghostwater, and she's blocked by the monarch. That makes sense. He's at least 1 or 2 rankings above her, but the way she describes how much different his power level is compared to hers, I mean, it's massive. And then when she's describing how she gets locked out of Ghostwater, Mercy thinks to herself, how did someone compete with your power? Who even could? Well, she's probably talking about the other people on the island at the time, right? So we have a herald, the Beast King. We have another sage, the Sage of Red Faith, right? She said none of that, they wouldn't have been able to stop her from getting in. So if a herald can't stop a sage from getting in, they're probably not too far off in power. But a monarch? Crazy. So that's what I think. I think a sage is an arc lord who creates techniques so refined that they are able to incorporate the next level magic system before the advancement. And because of that, because of their dedication to their path, creating techniques so specialized that uses this extra magic system in addition to their soulfire and their Madra, they distinguish themselves as sages because they become so specialized. So that's why you have to be a type of sage. You can't be a jack of all sages. You have to be very, very specialized, because that's the only way you can become so perfect with abilities that you're able to access and channel that higher magic system. It's like the finesse way of doing it, the crisp technique way of doing it. Whereas a herald might be like the brute force, the brute strength. Less finesse, more brute strength. That's speculation. I don't know. But that's kind of where I'm going with that. Okay, so now I want to take a quick minute to walk through what we know the hints that we've gotten about the other magic system. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's going to be important about the nature of progression going forward. So the other magic system. The only hint we've seen added in the books that has been confirmed by Will is this passage here. On that corpse sat Northstrider, monarch on the path of the hungry deep. He sat cross-legged in a cycling position as the blood aura rose around him. With a deep breath, he cycled it into his core. The vitality of dragons seeped into him, strengthening his body and his spirit. Here's the important part. A spark within his soul carried the image of a dragon, majestic and roaring. It fed upon the imprint of the dragon's life that remained in this aura. It fed upon the imprint of the dragon's life that remained in this aura. Every part of him was nourished by this creature's power, and now there was one fewer dragon in the world. Oh, let's unpack this real quick. Okay. So initially when I read this, I thought this was talking about weaving soulfire. Little did I know, I was like 4 stages down the line. I was way off, right? When I asked Will about this at DragonCon of 2018, I asked him if this had to do with soulfire, and he said no. But it does have to do with another magic system. So I was like, sweet. All right, we know that there's another magic system now. So let's talk about that for a second. I think that that is the magic system that sages are tapping into. And I think it has to do with why they practice the sacred arts, for whatever reason. And we're going to talk about specifics real quick. I mean, this video is only 21 minutes long so far. It's got to hit that half-hour mark. So with the breath, he cycled it into his core, but a spark within his soul carried the image of a dragon, majestic and roaring. So this tells me a couple things. Northstrider might have once been a dragon. And perhaps when he was progressing and went along his path, something happened that made him rebel against his race. Something about his path, or what happened to him, made him choose a path of destroying his own kind. I don't know if this is true, but maybe. And when he progressed to Lord, his reason for practicing the sacred arts was to consume other dragons. That's why he's on the path of the hungry deep. It also might be why he doesn't want to ascend, because he doesn't know if there are dragons in the rest of the universes to go after. Little does he know that there are, and that is confirmed in the Word of Will. But the spark within his soul, carrying the image of the dragon, majestic and roaring, which is probably his view of himself, it fed upon the imprint of the dragon's life that remained in this aura. So something about the imprint of that dragon's life nourishes the spark within his soul. So that's another magic system. I think it has to do with his connection with doing the sacred arts, because it goes back into, and now there was one fewer dragon in the world. So if his purpose is practicing the sacred arts is to, I practice the sacred arts so that less dragons can exist. And then as he progresses along with more soul fire, he gets deeper into that truth. And then the deepest truth of that is, that he I don't know what the deepest truth is, honestly, but it has to do with the fact that he carries an image of a dragon, majestic and roaring, that feeds upon the imprint of other dragons' life. So that has something to do with his progression of why he practices the sacred arts and his deeper connection with magic in general. So he's not only connected to Vital Aura anymore. He's now connected with the life forces of other creatures that he defeats. It's like that computer analogy. He's getting closer and closer to manipulating the core functions of the computer or the core functions of the universe. But in this case, it's the core functions of Cradle, or maybe his iteration, or maybe his sector. Not sure. Don't know how that works. But that's what I think is going on. Now, how this pertains to a sage. So this is pretty broad. Northstrider wants to kill dragons, right? I don't think Northstrider was ever a sage, because his path is so broad. It uses dragons' powers against dragons. Whereas the sword sage, his reason for practicing the sacred arts probably had to do with swordsmanship. It was so devoted to swordsmanship that he went down this path that was so razor thin and specific that he was able to unlock unique abilities pertaining to the sword alone. So he became a sword sage, because he was able to connect his self with the universe so closely related to the sword. Now, Akura Charity, the Sage of Silverheart, she's a heart sage. So something about her connection with the way probably has to do with her emotions. We know that Akura Charity and Akura Fury fight for a cause. I'm looking at the quote right now. Mercy met the sage face to face, staring her down as though they were equals. You know it isn't healthy. The family isn't fighting for a cause like you are, Uncle Fury. So I think that she's a heart sage focused on abilities that have to do with emotions of some kind, human emotion, and she fights for a cause. I don't know what the cause is, but I think that cause, that connection with human emotions, is what led her to becoming a heart sage. Okay? We see her playing people against each other, like, relentlessly. We see her, like, pushing people and, like, manipulating people and really messing with people. She lives in a world of dreams and abstractions, being a heart sage. And Mercy says she has a hard time connecting with everyday people. So she's, like, conducting these large, emotional, human experiments, like pitting people against each other. She loves competition. I don't know. But I think that has something to do with how sages are different than heralds. Heralds are able to use this extra magic system along with monarchs in a broader way towards their broader reason for practicing the sacred arts. But sages have a very specific reason for practicing the sacred arts. And so they're able to tap into that magic system earlier because they only have to focus it on the one type of technique, whether it's sword techniques, or I think the winter sages might even be an elemental sage, where she's like all based on ice, like ice and swords, but mainly ice. So that's interesting. So that's what's different between a sage and a herald, is that a sage is focused on one type of technique, and a herald, their reason for practicing the sacred arts is more broad. It's not focused enough to become a sage. So think about that. Of all of our main characters, who has a path or a reason for practicing the sacred arts focused enough to become a sage? Honestly, it doesn't really matter. I can't really think of any of them at this point that do. Lyndon fights so he's not weak and pathetic anymore. Yaren fights so she doesn't have to see anyone else die. And Mercy practices the sacred arts to make her mom proud. But we keep hearing that you get access to Soulfire by learning about who you are, but it has nothing to do with who you become. And that's what Charity told her. That's what her mother, Malice, told her. So I think who you become can lead you down the path of the sage or the path of the herald, depending on how broad or how focused your reason for practicing the sacred arts are. And that concludes my video on the Sages of Cradle. Thank you for watching. Check out the videos that are showing now. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. I'm not going to stop making these videos. The more books that come out, the more theories are going to come out. I've got endless amounts of content to make, so I'm going to keep making them because it's what I love to do. So thank you for your support.